What's up, everybody? It's Bryant the Flowhawk, and in this video, I'm going to talk to you about launching a SharePoint form into a full page experience right from SharePoint. So, there's some interesting things I've learned along the way here. I'll point out as we go along, but the idea is if I double click this item, it's going to pop out in this pane, this form experience for me. SharePoint out of the box or custom Power Apps. And instead, I want it to launch that in the web as a full page experience. So let's jump in and I can show you everything that I learned about this. So, first things first, let's talk about what this is. It's a SharePoint form out of the box. If I double click this, it's going to launch out this little pane and it's going to show me that list item. Okay. These will be filled with the values from the list item if I've double clicked an item. If I click new, it's going to have them all blank. I could copy the link to this form, okay, and provide that to other people. If I come here to a new tab and I paste that form in, you'll notice that it's in here, but it's kind of embedded as a part of that SharePoint experience. All right. One thing that I'll note is it's got here a source that's to help it know which way to go back to when you're all done. It's also got a content type ID, which doesn't really send that to the form. But if I delete all of that extra stuff, and so I go after new form.aspx and I go env equals embedded, okay, and I paste that in there, you'll notice that I have this full page experience now for this form. So there's one way to get a full page experience. All right, I'll just kind of leave that there. We can come back to it. Now, let's take a look as if we customize this with Power Apps. All right, I haven't customized this with Power Apps before. This is the first time I'm opening this list form in SharePoint to customize with Power Apps. It's going to open it up, generate it for me. And while it does, let's talk for a second about a Canvas app versus a list form app. I will never find this form in my Power Apps lists in make.powerapps.com. It kind of exists outside of that, but this app does have an app ID, and there's interesting things that we can do with the app ID. There's also something worth noting when it comes to licensing. Any user who has access to the SharePoint list can open up the SharePoint form, whether it's customized with Power Apps or whether it's out of the box SharePoint. Any user can open it. However, a Canvas app requires a specific license, especially if it has premium connectors in it. Okay, so that's something also worth pointing out. If I've got external users using my SharePoint site, they can open up a list form that's been customized with Power Apps without any sort of licensing. So, something to keep in mind as well. All right, here I am. I've landed here. This is my customization. I don't know why I just closed that. Let me add a few fields here. Assigned to, date reported, issue logged by, issue source, issue description, name. All right, just a handful of these things. I'll click add, and that will add them to my SharePoint form. Okay, I don't see the fields. There they are. Perfect. Now let me show you something, okay? The SharePoint integration piece, this comes only with forms customized from SharePoint. If I click that and go down the dropdown, I have these properties. I have on cancel, on edit, on new, on save, and on view. Let's take a look at on new. On new, it's going to create the new form for SharePoint Form 1. All right, it's going to run that command. That's going to put this form into new mode, meaning that all of these blanks will be empty. In the on view, it's going to put it in view mode, and on edit, it's going to put it in edit mode. If I click on this form, when it's in new mode, it doesn't care what's in its item property because it just goes and uses blank. If it's in edit mode or view mode, here's what the code is that's running for its item. It's wondering if the SharePoint integration.selected is blank or if it's empty. And if that's the case, then just grab the first item from the list. So if something goes wrong, it wants to show you an item, and that's how it's going to do it. Otherwise, it's going to run with the SharePoint integration.selected. Okay, so that's all really important to know. Let's change this, since we're going into a full screen experience for this form, let's go into the settings and under display, let's change this from portrait to landscape. And let's keep it as large. Okay, that's going to give us a much larger experience, one that's more fit for kind of a full screen view. I'm also going to select my form and change it from one column to two or three. Makes that a better experience when you have super wide fields like that. All right, so here we are. This is kind of our form experience. Now you'll notice there's no save button. There's no submit button. The SharePoint integration piece actually has the on save, which submits the form, or on cancel, which resets the form. Okay, so those are all built in here. If I were to save this and publish, okay, let's come back to our new item. This is what launched before. Let's keep the same URL and I'll just refresh the page. It may take a few times. Oh, this is loading our app now. Loading, loading, loading. Okay, so this is our new form. This is one of the full screen experiences that I wanted to talk to you about. All right, this experience is within the SharePoint wrapper, which means when I fill this out, I can use these buttons that are in the browser to submit it or to cancel it. What happens when I hit that save button? That's determined in the SharePoint integration on save. Okay, and what happens when I hit the cancel button is in the on cancel. Now, there's another method to get this in full screen that I want to talk to you about, okay? Because we can't necessarily launch this experience by default. There is something we can do where we do the, let's say, edit form. And when it's in edit form, we can actually pass it ID equals, and let's say 1, and I'll put an ampersand so we can still have it in the embedded type of experience. Let's run this, and that will actually grab that item that matches ID 1, and it'll throw it in the form and put it in edit mode. So it's loading here. You see the breadcrumb trail already, test issue 1, and here's all of the values from those columns of that item number 1. So if we can construct this URL, let's copy this, and you can actually come back to SharePoint. If we had SharePoint open, let me duplicate this page and hit cancel. It should take us back to SharePoint. Or we can just hit the list name here on the breadcrumb. Okay, this is our issue tracker list. We can actually modify the column. Okay, so if I hit this column, right click or hit it, and then column settings, format this column, I can actually use JSON in here and make this column a hyperlink with a dynamic ID, and I can have it so if you click this, it hyperlinks you to that new tab with the URL with the ID in it. Okay, so it can launch this from the column. But that's another video for another day. What I wanted to show you today is if I take this this app, let me close this piece, and I go to save it, I can see all versions after I've saved it. So if I click view all versions here, it will give me something called the app ID. And if I've got the app ID, I can construct a URL for this app. All right, here's my app ID. If I land at the versions, I go to the details tab. There's my app ID. I can actually create a URL, https://web.powerapps.com slash apps slash and put your app ID. I believe this is it. Let's take a look and see. All right, and this is actually going to launch my app in Power Apps. Now, the thing that's worth noting here is that it actually loaded in that first item. And that first item is because it didn't receive anything from the SharePoint connection. When you load this in the browser using a URL constructed like this, it's going to not have a connection to SharePoint whatsoever, and SharePoint will always send the ID value of 1. Okay, and I can actually add to the end of this URL these two pieces. Right, it's a question mark to start the parameters, and then skip app metadata equals true and hide navbar equals true. If I add those there and I rerun that URL, it's actually going to hide even the top navigation bar from Office 365. I'm completely immersed into this experience of this app, and there's no buttons whatsoever for me to submit this item. Okay, so a couple things that we have to take care of there. Number one, we have to have some sort of handling for figuring out what the ID of this item is. And number two is we have to find a way to submit and save this item. Okay, so let's come back to our app in Power Apps. All right, what I like to do is add here a parameter. So this SharePoint form is working off of the SharePoint integration dot selected. Okay. What we'd rather do for the item here is say if param, and if you've never used the parameters function, these are things I can pass in the URL of the app and it will read it in here for me. Okay. We'll call it item ID. That's what I want to call this. Um, if is blank item ID. So if we didn't get an item ID, we're going to actually, we can, what I like to do is this. So we come here and for the item property, we do a lookup and our list name is issue tracker. We'll go issue tracker. We're going to look up where ID equals, and here we're going to use the param function. This allows us to pass a parameter through the URL here. We'll call that parameter item ID, and I'll show you how we'll pass that in the URL. Okay. That's going to be our item. And this little thing says we're comparing a number with text. That's right. Every time we get a parameter in, it's actually stored as text, even if it's a number. So we convert it to value. Okay. So basically, it's going to look at the URL, grab an item ID number, and then look up which item from the issue tracker this is. Now let's take a look at the mode of this. Okay. Default is edit. But since we're kind of not going off of the SharePoint, and the SharePoint integration is what was setting that as new, edit, view, we're going to do a switch statement. And this one is going to be off of the parameter called, um, well, let's go is blank parameter of item ID. Meaning if we didn't get an item ID, this form is going to go into form mode.new. If we didn't get an item ID, we'll assume they want to do a new item. Okay. Otherwise, they'll go into an edit form mode. All right, this is just a simple scenario. Let's change this from a switch to a if statement. Sorry about that. Okay, so if the parameter is blank, meaning we didn't get it from the URL, then do a new form. If it's not blank, then put it into edit mode. Okay. So this is perfect. Now we will need to accept or expect an item ID from the URL. So here's what we're going to do. This is the part that gets really, really fun. Let me save this and publish it. And let's come back here and go and item ID equals 1. Okay, so we've got that. If I run this, all right, this brings in item 1 in edit mode. And if I remove that item ID, it should launch the form into new mode. Ta-da! All right, so we've done that correctly. Now, how do we get here? Okay, this is an exit for us or a destination. How do we on-ramp ourselves to this point? Well, it's all in the SharePoint integration piece. Since we know when someone's going to be viewing, when someone's going to be clicking that new button on edit, we can actually change the experience for each one of these. All right, let's start with the on new. This is what was there before, setting that form as new. I'm going to comment it out. And instead, what we want to do is launch a URL of our choice. And this is the URL. Okay. And since I don't include an item ID, this is actually going to launch it into new mode. So I'll close that. And we could actually put our parameters, the launch function accepts parameters here. You see here we did skip app metadata is true and hide nav bar is true. Just for the sake of using this function the way that it's supposed to be, let's put those in here. And the notation is a colon. And now everything is text. Okay. And we'll do a comma and hide nav bar. That's going to be a colon, and true again is going to be stored as text. So that's how we're passing those parameters. We'll do a comma, and the target is the tab to launch this in. If I type target, you'll see we have launch target, new, or replace. Replace would launch it in the same tab that I'm currently in. New would put it in a new tab. So let's go new. We would want this to launch in a new tab, right? And then there's a handy function called request hide. Okay. So this is pretty interesting. Now if we have a new, it's going to launch this in a new tab, and then it's going to hide the pane. That's what request hide does, is it hides that pane in SharePoint. Let me save this and publish it. And let's take a look now. If I come back to SharePoint, right, refresh this. Now, if I click the new button, it's going to launch this for me. And it actually went to pop me up in a different window. I've got a pop-up blocker on, so I've got to accept and allow the pop-ups there. But let's try that again. New, and it actually popped me into this other experience. You see it added the skip app metadata to be true, and it threw our hide nav bar to be true, and here we are in the web with a full experience. Now we still haven't added our submit and cancel buttons here, but how incredible and amazing is that? Okay, let's do the same on edit, because still on edit, if I double click this, it's going to get my data here. And actually, we changed all of the data pieces, so that's not even going to work. So let's now modify the on edit. And let me just copy the on new. Okay, we'll copy this. But this one's a little bit different. So if we go on edit, again, I'll comment that out just so we still have it there if we ever want to go back to it. Okay, here we need to also add in item ID. And here's where we're going to use the SharePoint integration dot selected list item ID. Perfect. And this is actually the same thing that we'll do. This is in on edit, and that's when I'm on my list. I have an item selected and I hit edit. But if I double click this, it's going to open it in view. And so we also need to do this in on view. All right. So again, we'll comment out what was there and paste this in. Awesome. Now let's just add in the button here. So we can insert a button. If you've got a scrollable screen, this is a little more difficult because you've got to put the button right where it's supposed to go. Um, and I don't know what's going on there with the rendering, but we'll just say save on this button. And in the on select of it, we'll just submit the form. Okay, submit form, SharePoint form 1. And then what I like to do as well is just send them to a success screen. I'm not going to do that in this video, but you'll see what happens there. If we choose cancel, let's say there's another button here. And this is our cancel button. And fill color wise, let's make that one red. On select, we don't want to submit the form. Um, what we want to do um, is we want to exit. You can do a launch. You can send them back. Um, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to hit exit there. Now let's save this. Let's publish it. Perfect. Okay, now I'm on my list. Let me refresh this list. We saw what happens when I hit new. It opened up a new form for me in a different tab. If I double click this, every time I publish a new version, it takes it a second to load it. Okay, so now it's popped me up into this new tab. And if I look, it's got in the URL item ID equals 1, and it's using that param function to pull that in. So it's looking up that item for me. Perfect. If I change the status here to be completed and I hit save, okay, that's been saved. Normally I'll do a notification or I'll send to a success screen, but in this case, I didn't. And now if I come look in SharePoint, that's marked as completed. Okay, so everything works the way that we'd want. If I hit cancel, it'll exit and send me to office.com, which I think is kind of funny. That's Microsoft's um, exit feature is it sends you to office.com there. All right, that's it in a nutshell. That's how you auto navigate to a full screen experience from a SharePoint list using out of the box forms. Again, one thing I didn't mention is anytime you construct a URL using Power Apps in it, it's going to look for a Power Apps license. This experience with Power Apps, this is not going to work for any external contacts because they're not licensed. And this no longer falls under a SharePoint form technically. We're accessing this as a standalone application, which is what causes users to have an issue here. So you won't want to go this route if you've got external folks accessing your form. But if you've got all internal folks, they're E3, E5 licenses, they don't even need a special Power Apps license for this because it's all Office connectors. If you were to add a premium connector, that's a different story. But everyone would be able to access this. And how cool that we got that all to happen by clicking these buttons or double clicking this list item. We can choose what the experience is like. So, thanks for sticking with me. I know it was a long one. Hopefully, this is helpful to you and super interesting because I thought it was as I went through and figured out that I could do an auto navigate with all these different SharePoint items. And maybe that'll trigger something for you that can help down the road do other interesting and creative things. Leave me a comment so I can know what you're doing with this stuff. As always, thanks for sticking with us.